In March 1984, coal miners in Britain walked out on strike against the pit closure plan of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government. Miners' wives and other women started support groups up and down the country which were instrumental in helping the workers hold out for nearly a year in an iconic dispute which changed Britain forever. This is Working Class History. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the crucial role women played in the Great Miners' Strike of 1984-5, and we are very pleased to be joined by Heather Wood, who was chair of the Easington Women's Support Group in County Durham, North East England. We are going to be doing other episodes about the strike, so I'll just give a very brief historical background here. At the time, coal miners in the National Union of Mine Workers were the best organised and most militant section of the working class in Britain. Miners held successful nationwide strikes in 1972 and 1974 when they brought down the Conservative government of Edward Heath. With the election of Thatcher in 1979, her Conservative Party were determined to reshape the UK from a more social democratic state with high levels of state ownership and where working people were organised and had some economic power to a more neoliberal one where there was more widespread private ownership and there was a more atomised working class. Her strategy was to isolate different groups of workers and defeat them one by one, and the most important fight was against the miners. The government had prepared for the strike, and then provoked it by announcing pit closures and job losses at a time which would be favourable for them, shortly after their re-election and when coal stocks were high. The government's hope was that they'd then be able to sit out the strike until the miners and their families were basically starved back to work. But around the country, thousands of miners' wives and other women set up support groups which raised money, collected food, cooked for tens or even hundreds of thousands of people every day, and confronted police and scabs on picket lines. Many of these groups came together in an umbrella organisation called Women Against Pit Closures. They played an absolutely key role in the dispute, in enabling the 200,000 odd strikers to hold out for nearly a year. What women did in Easington is a microcosm of what happened all over Britain. Over the course of the interview, Heather references some people and events which won't be known by everyone, but we didn't want to interrupt the flow of the interview, so instead we have put in short explanations of these people and things and who they were in the show notes. To start off with, can you introduce yourself and let us know where you're from?
I'm Heather Wood from Easington Colliery, County Durham, an ex-mining village.
Right, hello and welcome. And so can you let us know, so what was your life situation at the beginning of 1984?
Well, I was a member of the Labour Party and quite active in politics, and I was working at the local council offices in the housing department. And my husband was a plumber who worked full-time, and we had 2 children. And, well, in 83, I was chair of the constituency Labour Party, and we had heard rumours that pits were going to close in our area, in our district. So we decided that we needed to inform people, and we set up the constituency, had an open public meeting, and we established how many people were interested in having to fight for the community and fight to save jobs. And we set up an organisation called Save Easington Area Mines. We call it SEAN for short. And it was that same year, 83, when we had what was then the biggest rally of miners' banners outside of Durham Big Meeting, and it was in Easington. Neil Kinnock was there, and he was one of the speakers. And I chaired that meeting, and from there we just went on giving out public information as to what the cost to our villages would be if the mines closed. And then, of course, along in early 84 came the strike, and my own village, the pit, voted to come out on strike. And my husband and I said, well, 2 things. We wanted somebody to fight the government, The second one, and the main one, was we want our community to remain as it is, a close-knit community who help each other. So we decided that we'd give £5 a week to the fund. But as with everything in my life, it was like Topsy. It grew and grew and grew. And I decided a couple of weeks into the strike, I mentioned at the scene meeting, that we needed to get at the women in the mining communities, because without the women, the men would not stay out on strike, because contrary to public belief, miners' wives are not held down, they rule. And if their wives had said, you go back, they'd have had to go back. So what I said was, all the literature that was coming out to the villages then, to the houses of miners, was from the union. So it was more than likely to be read by the men and not the woman of the house. So we got together, three of us, Dave Temple, Brian Blanchard and myself, in our house, and we put together a letter for every woman in Easington district. We had to do that because there was nobody had a list of where each miner lived in the district, so we just decided to leaflet every house. We had a meeting of women in the council offices at Easington Village. The council chamber was absolutely full with women. It was wonderful to see that so many wanted to be part of and wanted to support and stand beside the husbands or the brothers or the fathers. And from there, we formed the first support group, which was in Easington Colliery, and I went to the Miners' Lodge at Easington just to let them know what we were doing. And just as an aside, the two of us women had to sit outside of the meeting while the men decided whether a woman could come into the lodge meeting. And after about half an hour, the debate had gone on, and they came out and said we could enter. And I remember saying to Alan Cummins, the secretary of the lodge, once I'm in, I'm not going back, And he laughed, and it was true, because we went from strength to strength. But we set up from there, we went to all the different communities in Easington district and some beyond, and had set up support groups there. And I attended lodge meetings to let the miners know what each of those groups were doing. We set up in Easington district 14 support groups, which either provided food, that by way of a meal each day, or food parcels, where they couldn't provide a meal but they would raise funds for food parcels. And I'm pleased to say that I can now speak of my own community, Easington. We had our free cafes in Easington Colliery Workmen's Club, and for a year we fed people one meal a day for 5 days a week. And during the school holidays, I wrote to the county council to ask if we could use the school kitchens, and I'm pleased to say they said yes. So that made life so much easier. For instance, my mother was an ex-cook for school meals, so she knew the school kitchens well. And for the 6 weeks, we were able to provide a really good meal for those children. And the mum and dad used to pay for, and my mum would make a dessert for the children. So the adults didn't get a dessert for that 6 weeks, but the children got looked after. We raised funds from all over the world. And in fact, in Beamish Museum, there is a section that's called the Heatherwood Collection. And that has every photograph, every press cutting, every notice that we sent out to people about the strike, and giving them information on where you could go to get this, that and the other, with regards especially to school uniforms after the summer holidays. So it was a busy year. Christmas, we did all sorts of Christmas, and we kept going for a year, and I'm proud to say I was part of it.
At your peak, when you were doing this, do you know how many kind of local women were sort of helping you in these groups?
Without actively working in the groups, there were no more than a dozen women in each of the 14 groups. But the important thing to remember is it wasn't just the women who came out and did something in the support groups that kept the strike going. It was the women in the houses, where they had to keep the household going on very, very little money. And that wasn't an easy task. So you're talking about every miner's wife was involved and was active, in the sense that they motivated their husbands to stay on strike. They may have gone and stood to wave the picket buses off on a morning or to welcome them back on a night. So they were active, even though they weren't out making meals or being organised as far as fundraising is concerned. But I have to say, the women in the support groups, a lot of them weren't politically motivated when they started. It was to save their communities and save their futures for their children and their grandchildren. So it was very difficult to talk to them about the political side of the strike. But as the weeks went on and there was sort of drip fed about what was happening, they started to ask questions and they started to want to go to places where there was political discussion and to want to be on the picket lines. And some of them actually spoke in public meetings, which they'd never ever done before, gone on television and been interviewed, helped to put together a book, The Last Calls of Spring, which was poems and songs and short stories written by the women of Easington. They were approached by Northern Arts to have a writer in residence. Margaret Pine came and she wrote a play, Not by Bread Alone, about the miners' strike, and that was performed around the North East. Then it went to London. Then it went to the Lamplish Theatre in Germany and Oldenburg University. So they were big things from women who came out to make a meal for a few hundred people. They'd ended off organising all this themselves. Fantastic.
So do you think that that had a transformative effect on some of the women that were involved?
It definitely did. Yes, it definitely did. As I say, at the beginning, they wanted to make meals, which is very important. But as time went on, they wanted to know more of what was going on with the strike, the political side of the strike, and they wanted to go and stand on the picket line and fight for the jobs in the community. That way, they didn't necessarily want to go and speak on television or in meetings, but they did it in the end because I was doing it all, and I said, it's just too much. You're going to have your names in a hat, and when it's your turn, you do it. And thank God they did. One woman who was one of the quietest people you could wish to meet, she ended off with one of the biggest rallies in Middlesbrough with Tony Benn on the platform with her. And all she said was, I work for British Coal, I'm a cleaner, and I'm on strike. My husband's a miner, he's on strike. We have 2 children. Can you help us? Now, the crowd erupted because it was obvious that woman wasn't used to being where she was. But after that, that woman went to Greenham Common, she came on rallies with us, she was out on the picket line, she wasn't frightened to speak up. That made all the difference there. So instead of coming out and doing a job and then going home quietly, you know, sort of, it's a bit like they changed the world, but they hadn't realised they had, so they just went back to what they were doing. Where in the strike, it continued on, it grew. Some of them went on to be, well, Juliana Herron, she was, I think she's been mayor twice. She's from the South Hetton support group. And she hadn't really been involved in politics before the strike. And she's still involved. You know, there's people like her who've continued on the fight. There's women who went on to parish councils or who just became more active in the community doing voluntary work, fundraising for whatever, organising. And I think that's important to know that those women, although they were doing it before, they did things very quietly. Now they shout more and say, look, this is what we do and you better write it all down. It needs to be written for history.
Can I ask, you've spoken about the kind of transformative effect that the strike had on a number of, you know, women who became kind of more vocal and in what they were doing and more confident. How did husbands react to that? Was there any anxiety about that from them?
I think it was strange at first. Nobody ever really said anything, but it was strange for some of them because it was out of the ordinary for them to do. I mean, in our house, it was just something that happened. I was always out doing something politically, but it was something that changed. And I've got no doubt that it would have been difficult because the men, this is where it comes in, the masculinity to me, because it's not even the masculinity, just the fact that they would normally be at work. But now they had time on their hands, so they were taking the children to school. They were standing at the school gates to pick the bairns up. You know, they were housekeeping because a lot of the women went and got part-time jobs at factories and in shops. So they were now looking after the household. So there's bound to have been some, because, I mean, if it was in our house, I'd be saying that John couldn't do it as well as I could, so there would be aggro there, apart from having no money. But so there's bound to have been, and I know as we went into the strike, as the months went by, the women in our support group in Easington, that I speak for now, they were getting quite despondent, and money was getting really short, and bills were coming in, so tempers were getting fraught. And I remember there were a few Barneys just within the women, and I'd said, I'll tell you what, when we meet every Thursday, which we did to organise the following week, just when you're at home, write down how you're feeling about something, or just come and speak on it at our next meeting. And they did that, and that's where, I mean, there was some really humdinger of arguments, but what I said was, you do that in the meeting, and then you walk out. The cause is bigger than you and your argument with whoever. We're united when we walk out that door. And you know it worked? It actually worked. And from there, they did write songs, stories, poems, and they were published. So out of all that aggro came something that was really good. The women were stronger, they worked better together, and they put together a book, which they would never have done probably. So yes, I think there's been arguments. I've got no doubt about that, because it must be strange. You're changing roles completely. There were divorces, but in the main, everybody was united. They all stood together.
Before the strike happened, do you think, would it be accurate to say that these were kind of quite traditional male-dominated communities?
Well, I think that's a fallacy, because, as I say, the women have always, when you look back in the history of mining communities, it's always been the women who've come out to get things done. For instance, we needed, when I was a little girl, I can remember, there were no indoor toilets and bathrooms. So it was the women who took to the streets and blockaded the main road to the pit with their pushchairs and prams and whatever to fight for the coal board to fit bathrooms and indoor toilets to the colliery properties. And the 26th strike, it was mainly women. 74, it was mainly women who were out at front doing it. I think because miners come across as they were very strong men, and the women don't necessarily come out and say, oh, we do this, we do that. It doesn't mean they weren't doing it. They were doing it in the home. They looked after the money. The husband tipped the money up. They looked after all the bills, and there were very few who didn't do that.
You know, you mentioned that you and other women in the community also joined picket lines with the strikers. How did that go?
Well, I used to go down every morning and take my children down. And here's a for instance for you. August the 24th, 1984, Easington was taken over by police. And that was because on the evening of August the 23rd, Piers Merchant, Tory MP, was on the news saying, why is it Durham Constabulary can't get one man in at Easington Pit? Because they had been bringing them to the village and more or less saying, you know, you've tried, you're only lad, just go home. But the next morning after Piers Merchant said that, I went to take my children to school, and our village green, which is enormous, was black. It was full of police. And we got further down the road, and there was a police cordon, so I had to stop and tell them where we were going. And I said, I'm going to my mum to drop the children off. And he said, okay, you can go. And just as we were passing, before I got the window wound up, the youngest son shouted, but Mum, you didn't tell him we were going to picket lines first. And I could have killed him. But that was me going to the picket lines. But there were other women who went, and they went a lot more than me because I was working. They went and stood, and one of the things we always say is they were going to arrest women because we were shouting scab. So we put half the women at one side of the road and half at the other, and one half shouted ska and the other shouted ab. So we got it in unison eventually, and we couldn't be arrested. My mum was on the picket line the day the first man went back at Easington Colliery, who lived in Easington. And she saw the women were telling me, because I wasn't there, she said, I can't shout scab. So she shouted, come on, Bonnie lad, don't go back in. And as it happened, he didn't go. And my mum always says it's because she just shouted, come on, Bonnie lad, don't go in. But yeah, it was life-changing, I think. People saw another side of life and started to want to organise the picket, rather, try to organise the men and get as much activity as we could along by the pit.
How did the police react to women on the picket line? Because prior to that point, I think they were quite used to wading in and attacking all the miners with baton charges and whatnot. Were they any different with the women?
It was name calling. That was the biggest thing. I can't think. I mean, I know there were women in different parts of the country, and there were a couple of women from Hetton, Florence Anderson being one, who were arrested. But in Easington, it was name calling. It was trying to put you down as a woman. It was waving £10 notes in your face or in van windows as they were passing you. You were made to feel like dirt. And very frightened. I was frightened. I'm no shame in saying that. I was frightened because I'd seen what they could do. And I'm still frightened because I'd seen what the state can do. They were an arm of the state. And if the state can do that to people who weren't at risk to the state, what else can they do? So frightening.
What sort of things were they doing?
Well, they used to stand at the pit yard outside the pit wall, and they would be linked arm in arm, and every now and again they would open up and just take one lad through, and then they would arrest him and he would be charged with God knows what, and he'd be at court and then he'd be in prison and never done anything in his life. I keep saying to people keep saying, that can't have happened, but I saw it with my own eyes. There was somebody last week said to me, the reason the police didn't have numbers on the jackets was because they were torn off by the miners. Well, August the 24th, I watched them come into my village and they came in with no numbers on their jackets. Also, there was no fighting, no problems as such, no hand-to-hand fighting. At that point in Easington, there was not. So it's a lie, it's a fallacy, it's a misinterpretation of what went on to say that they came in with those numbers on the jackets, because they didn't.
So as the strike progressed, did then violence break out in Easington?
Well, at one point, there was a police car turned over and there were some windows put out at the colliery offices, but it wasn't anything on the lines of Orgreave. I mean, my God, Orgreave is just horrendous. But it was the way that after those cars had been turned over, the way people were picked up on the streets and taken to court, and even if they just happened to be passing them, were arrested. I know one young lad who'd been taking his girlfriend home, they picked him up as somebody involved in that. He was taken to court and the judge just said, I'm not listening to individual stories, I'm treating you all the same, you're going to prison. He went to prison, and it happens it was a relative of mine, and he was still at home with his parents. While his parents were on holiday, the governor of the prison rang my mother and said, it's quite clear that this lad shouldn't be here, and if you are prepared to accept responsibility and make sure he gets back, I'm prepared to release him to sit his exams at college. And that happened. Now, that was the enemy within, so you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just incredible what the state could do.
Yeah. And so you've mentioned at some point police started trying to get scabs back to work. Were they successful in that in your area?
I'm proud to say that in Easington Colliery we had the least scabs. We had the least go back to work before the official day of returning. I can't remember the numbers, but it was a handful rather than a lot as the government would have it, that they were returning to work in droves before the vote. They certainly weren't here.
And how was that then in the community? Because presumably, you will have known who the scabs were and who their families were.
Yes. Well, for me and for a lot of other people, it's still the same. When you talk about certain people, you always end the conversation with, well, he was a scab. There's a photograph taken by Keith Patterson inside of the Colliery Club when the meals are being served. And one of the women who has a plate in her hand getting a meal, her husband went back to work. And I remember she told the press he was going back to work because they'd received no help from anybody. Well, there she was in the Colliery Club getting a meal, and her children were getting meals. Well, what other help did she want? It was just a blatant lie. It was an excuse for going back. But they'll not be forgotten. We might even speak now, we might say hello, but never be forgotten.
And so outside of your area, around the rest of the country, do you know what other things, women's groups were doing to support the strike?
Similar sorts of things. I mean, we actually went to Ollerton, Nottinghamshire, because Nottingham, of course, had very few people who were on strike, most scabbed, and that's where they formed the breakaway union. But we knew that the people in Ollerton who were on strike had very little because they didn't have the support of the local shops and everything that we had. So we actually got a minibus and took food down to them at Ollerton. And we stayed with them. And it was just so hard for them. I mean, they were worse off than we were because the numbers were totally different. There was more scabs going in than there were people on strike. So it must have been really, really hard for them. And they were getting the treatment that the scabs were saying that they were on the end of, people putting the windows in. That was the Nottingham strikers had their windows put in, had their people threatened. And like I say, Florence Anderson was arrested. Anne Scargill was arrested. Betty Cook. And they were in the Yorkshire area then. But we were all doing very similar things, working round the clock really, 7 days a week for a year, because while you weren't making meals, you were trying to organise, or you were trying to fundraise, or you were trying to picket, or you were trying to write stories, or, there was something all the time, every day.
Yeah, so, we've spoken a lot about the crucial role women played in this dispute. Do you feel that role has been kind of written out or forgotten from history somewhat?
Well, I think that the last 10 years, people have started to look at and to record more what the women did and the worth of the women in that strike. I mean, every year since the strike, I've had at least 2 students from universities all over the country who were doing dissertations on the women's groups in the strike. But in more recent years, you've got, Maxine Peake's just written a play about the women's support groups in the strike. I think that's on in Manchester now. You've got Lucy Brownley's doing a piece for the Durham Book Festival on me, my mother, and my 2 grandmothers. And it's about strong women in mining communities and that leading up to the strike. It's what I was saying earlier. Women just, over the years, they've just they've gone out, 26, did the soup kitchens in 26, went back. Came out, they wanted bathroom suites, they protested, went back. And just did it. This time we're saying we won't recognise them in history. That needs to be there, what women have done. And I don't know whether you saw the work that the Women's Banner Group did in Durham over this last 9 months, but there was a group formed to get a women's banner ready for the Durham Big Meeting, and we asked women throughout the county to depict what they do in patchwork, and we put a patchwork banner together with the help of Mary Turner, who's a Durham quilter, and that was paraded at Durham Big Meeting, and it was blessed. It's the first women's banner to be blessed in Durham Cathedral on Big Meeting Day with the other banners, and it's the first women's banner to be accepted into the Durham Miners Banner Group. So all this is going on. There's so much happening at the minute. People want to know about women and the work that women have done in our communities. It's amazing. So to me, I try to talk to everybody because it needs to be recorded. It needs to be written down, because otherwise the Tories, the capitalists, they'll write it their way and history will be changed.
It's great that women's role in the dispute is being better recognised and researched now. So if anyone wants to work with us on that, please get in touch. Going back to the strike, another thing you had to contend with was the media. Would you agree that media coverage was biased against the strike?
Yes, it was very much so. Like I say, it was always something, the pickets have been and smashed this place up. And in lots of cases it wasn't true. And look at Orgreave. They discovered how many years later that the film had been screened the wrong way around. It actually was the police going at the miners, and yet now we're asking for an inquiry. The government are refusing it. It's disgusting. We need justice, the way that they treat us. And the press, capitalist press, were against us. At one point the Mirror went, but in general the Mirror was with us. But it was always the headlines, the enemy within. Well, I mean, at the end we got to be quite proud that we were the enemy within. But like I said, behind the scenes, the journalist unions raised a lot of money to help us. They were doing their job and they were frightened of their job. If we could all just stick together, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it? All out strike.
No, too right. You said you were a member and activist in the Labour Party in a local branch. What did you think about the role of the National Labour Party in supporting the strike? Do you feel that they, sufficiently supported the strike?
Let us down. They let us down badly, very badly. When you think, I mentioned at the beginning of the interview that Neil Kinnock came to our village just a year before the strike, and he was all in support. His grandfather was a miner and all this, and then all of a sudden there was nothing. We were just left. We were the enemy within, and the likes of Kinnock were frightened off because the press were against us. And again, the reporters weren't against us because we were getting loads of money from their unions. It was the owners of the newspapers that were against us, but Kinnock and his ilk slotted in with that because they were frightened of their own future. No, it wasn't about the strike. It was about their future. They were looking after themselves, very much the same as they are today.
Do you have any particular sort of moments that happened that stand out in your memory or were particularly inspiring that we haven't gone over?
Have you seen Keith Patterson's photographs? There is no redemption. If you haven't, you need to see those photographs because they should be archived somewhere. Keith was a photographer in residence during the strike, and he got some absolutely magnificent shots. But one day when the first Easington scab was going back, the whole of Easington turned out, and I mean the whole of Easington, and the police were there. And Jussie Smith, who lived just near the pit, he'd just been in hospital for a stomach operation, and him and his wife had heard the commotion at the top of the street, and they went up to see what was going on. And before he even really got there, he was picked up by a policeman. There's photographic evidence of it, and he's being taken, manhandled, to a van by the police. And his wife is shouting, I want me man, what are you doing to him? So they picked her up and took her to the van. And the crowd erupted at that. So the police took Jussie and his wife back home and told them if they came out again, they would definitely be arrested. So it's things like that that stick in my mind. Oh, because not half an hour later, the police came back to Jussie and asked him if he would go out and quieten the crowd down. And these are so amazing things that you think can't happen in your village. Poor Jussie, arrested like that. They rang me, or somebody rang me that night and said, can you go down and see Jussie and his wife because they're in such a state? The other family that we were called to go to, their son was up and there was some rumpus about he'd had a counterfeit £50 note. It turned out it wasn't counterfeit, but searched his parents' house, ransacked it, contacted his employer in London, he was a chef, and raided his flat in London, all knowing that they'd seen the £50 note and it was okay. And that's the lad. I had to get Jack Dormand to go and get released from the police station. I went down to that lad's parents' house the night it happened, and his mother was sat, and she was riddled with arthritis. And I always remember, I'm a very visual person, and I remember her hands that were sort of all crooked and wizened and with the arthritis, and she was only very thin, and she was crying, and the house was lost. And I said to the husband, did they have a search warrant? And he said, no, Heather, but I asked them, and they said, we can go and get one, but it'll be worse when we come back. So they just let them ransack the house, and they didn't even tidy up afterwards. And the lad had done nothing wrong. So all those things stick forever in your head.
Yeah, well, I mean, a good lesson about not letting the police into your house, and that anecdote about the arrest of that man, and then everyone sort of coming together. I think it's a really good anecdote, because I think when you've experienced something like that, where a huge number of people all sort of come together, around a kind of singular thing that kind of unites them. I think when you kind of see that and experience that, it does kind of show you how the world can be a different place. How. Oh
yes, if we all stick together, we could do it.
Yeah.
But we fall in the Tory trap, and we fight each other rather than fight the real enemy.
But that's so far. We still have time.
One day. I always say I'm a utopian socialist, me. But I do hope we get it. It's like I always said to my children, aim high, and if you get halfway, you're all right.
And so, as the strike dragged on, and especially through the winter, when it was getting towards being a sort of year old, was there a point when you started to think it looked like you were going to, essentially, that the workers were going to be starved back?
In all of our hearts of hearts, I think we knew. I really do. We never talked about it out loud. And certainly when I was talking to the women, it was always, we can still do it, we can still win, we can do it. And I remember one day we'd been to Middlesbrough to a rally, and Hugh Bainin, who was the lecturer at Down Uni at that time and raised a lot of money for us, he was there, and Easington women were walking up ahead after the rally, and we'd just been saying to them, we can still do it, I think that was about the January, we can still do it, we can do it. And then Hugh and I just looked at each other and both had tears in our eyes, because we knew we weren't going to do it. But you have to have faith. You have to. You never know, it might have worked. But at the end of the day, I always say we didn't lose. Okay, they took our communities and everything, but they didn't take our self-respect, because we stood and we fought.
How did it feel when, it came around and the strike was lost and people voted to go back to work?
It was absolutely horrendous. I remember the day, I don't remember the date, but I remember the day we had there was a big meeting in Easington Welfare Hall, and the hall was packed. And Alan Cummins had spoke, Billy Stubbs had spoke, there were union officials, and I'd been asked to speak. And I can picture it now. I had my speech in my pocket, I'd written it, and I went to get it out of my pocket and I put it back, and I just spoke. It was quite heartbreaking. You're looking around at the sea of faces, people who fought for a year, and it's just sad. They felt defeated, and it took a long time for people, and still some people haven't realised we were brave in what we did. We didn't win the end game, but we were brave in what we did.
As you say, like the strike was lost about the immediate issue, unfortunately, but you said a lot of the participants in it were transformed by those sort of events. So, looking back, do you feel like there's a legacy of the strike or something good that's come out of it?
Something good, that's very difficult. I think one of the good things, was that women recognised that politics was for them, and they could get involved, and they did have a voice, and they could organise, and they could do things outside the home or work. That was the biggest thing. One of the biggest learning curves for all of us was how the state can operate against you, what it can do, the constraints they can put on you, the people that can be locked up for no reason. It learned us, I think it learned a lot of women about capitalism and hadn't thought about it. And they hadn't thought how politics affected their lives. And I mean, that went for some men as well, because I can remember saying to one man, have you looked at the political aspects? And he said, oh, politics, I'm not involved in politics. And I said, do you see that pint of beer? He said, yeah, what about? I said, the tax that's on that goes to government, so that pint of beer is political. You are committing a political act. Oh, I never thought about that, Heather. So it was opening people's eyes. So I think that was one of the good things. I just hope we don't forget it again, because the one about the state, because we were all surprised when the police landed in Easington the way they did. But we shouldn't have been, because look at Peterloo, look at 1926 strike. You know, the government have always gone out against us. So we shouldn't have been surprised. So it's important that things like this are done, recordings like this are made, so that people do remember what's gone on.
We're going to end today's episode with a recording of a speech made by Heather at a rally in Easington at the end of the strike, which features in the film Can't Beat It Alone by Amber Films, which you can check out through the link in the show notes. Before that, we'd like to thank you for listening and thank our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. You too can support this podcast at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, where you can also get early access to episodes, bonus audio and other benefits. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Catch you next time.
Well, I think over the last 12 months I've made some speeches, but I think this is the most nerve-wracking one of the lot, because really I don't know what to say to you all. I'm choked up because words can't say what I feel. You've been the greatest people, I think, that could ever exist, and I think people that this country, contrary to what Mrs. Thatcher says, we should be proud of, because I'm certainly proud to be part of this community. I think there's been a hell of a lot of suffering over the last few months, last 12 months anyway. But what we've got to remember is we've gained a lot from that suffering. All sections of our community, we've all come together. We weren't like that before the strike. I know we were to a certain extent, but we've never worked together like we have the last 12 months. We've got to continue it. Don't be downhearted, because I'm not. There was a young lad asked me in the welfare hall, just as the strike was over. He said, Heather, you know, do you think it was worth it, what we've done? And I answered him sharp. He might have thought I was a bit too sharp, but I certainly don't think it's over. It won't be over until we get Margaret Thatcher out, and until we win the case for coal, and until we win a good working class society for us all. And again, from the bottom of my heart, all of you, thanks very much for showing what good people you are. I only wish the press had put it over.